I'm Rachel Morgan, 41, and for 8 years I was the Star Acquisitions Director at Meridian Capital, the woman who closed impossible deals and built the company's reputation. Last month, during our biggest negotiation in company history, CEO Jonathan Whitfield pulled me aside with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Rachel, I'm giving you a well-deserved break. My son Ethan will be taking point on this one." Ethan was 22, fresh out of college with zero experience but plenty of confidence. I watched in stunned silence as 8 years of trust and expertise were swept aside for nepotism. The betrayal cut deep, but what happened next would expose a truth about loyalty, competence, and consequences that would reshape everything I thought I knew about my worth. If you've ever been overlooked or replaced, despite your proven track record, like and subscribe for more stories of workplace justice and empowerment. Looking back, I should have seen this coming. But when you're busy building something meaningful, you don't always notice the ground shifting beneath your feet. I started at Meridian Capital 8 years ago as a junior associate, fresh out of my MBA program with student loans that felt like a mountain I'd never climb. My desk was in the corner of the acquisitions department, squeezed between the copy machine and a filing cabinet that hadn't been updated since the 1990s. Most days, I felt invisible, but I had something that money couldn't buy and privilege couldn't: fake hunger. Every morning I arrived an hour early. Every evening I stayed until the security guard made his rounds. I read every deal memo, studied every contract, and memorized the names and preferences of clients I'd never met. My first major breakthrough came during my second year. The team was struggling with a mid-sized manufacturing acquisition that had been stalled for months. The client was threatening to walk, and the senior directors were ready to write it off as a loss. I'd been watching from the sidelines, taking notes, and I noticed something everyone else had missed. The client's CEO had mentioned during a casual conversation that his father had built the company from nothing after immigrating from Ireland. It was a throwaway comment, but it stuck with me. I spent my weekend researching Irish business customs and traditions. On Monday morning, I walked into the senior partner's office with a proposal that framed the acquisition not as a corporate takeover, but as a legacy preservation. The deal closed within 3 weeks. My commission was small, but the recognition was priceless. That framed contract now sits on my bookshelf at home, a reminder of what's possible when you pay attention to what others overlook. From there, my reputation grew steadily. I became known for the deals other people couldn't close, the difficult clients who needed someone who actually listened. I developed a methodology that went beyond numbers and projections. I studied the human element: what drove people to sell their life's work, what fears kept them awake at night, what dreams they harbored for their company's future. The tech boom of the last few years was my golden era. While other directors chased flashy startups with questionable fundamentals, I focused on established companies with solid foundations but outdated business models. I helped them find buyers who understood their potential, not just their current limitations. My success rate spoke for itself. 94% of deals closed, with an average value 23% higher than initial projections. I brought in over $2.3 billion in transactions. For Meridian Capital, earning the company hundreds of millions in fees. My clients sent referrals, competitors tried to poach me, and industry publications quoted my insights on market trends. But numbers only tell part of the story. The real foundation I built was trust. Clients knew that when Rachel Morgan handled their deal, it would be done right. They knew I'd fight for fair terms, navigate regulatory hurdles, and ensure their employees were treated with respect during transitions. I remember the night I realized I'd made it. I was working late on a particularly complex deal when Jonathan Whitfield himself stopped by my office. "Rachel," he said, "you've become the face of this company. Clients ask for you by name." Those words meant everything to me. I'd built something real, something valuable, something that couldn't be taken away. At least, that's what I thought. To understand what happened to me, you need to understand the Whitfield family and their relationship with Meridian Capital. This wasn't just a job for them. It was a legacy. A dynasty built on the assumption that blood mattered more than merit. Jonathan Whitfield's grandfather founded the company in 1952 with a single office in downtown Chicago and a dream of becoming the premier acquisition firm in the Midwest. By all accounts, he was a brilliant businessman who understood that success came from hard work and smart decisions. His son, Jonathan's father, expanded the company nationally during the 1980s boom, establishing offices in New York, Los Angeles, and Atlanta. But somewhere along the way, the Whitfield ethos shifted from earning success to expecting it. The family portrait in Jonathan's office told the story perfectly. 3 generations of Whitfield men in expensive suits, each more polished than the last, each more removed from the grinding reality of building a business from nothing. The grandfather's calloused hands had been replaced by manicured nails. The father's weathered face had given way to Jonathan's spawn-smooth complexion. And there, in the corner of the frame, was Ethan Young, privileged and completely untested. What struck me most about that portrait was what it didn't show. No women, no partners, no acknowledgement that perhaps the company's success might have come from people outside the family bloodline. It was a monument to entitlement disguised as tradition. I'd witnessed this dynamic play out in smaller ways. Over the years, Jonathan's nephew got fast-tracked through the internship program despite mediocre grades. A family friend's son landed a senior analyst position without the usual rigorous interview process. Each time, I told myself it was harmless, just taking care of people the way successful families do. But Ethan was different. From the moment he graduated from Harvard Business School, there was an inevitability about his trajectory that made my stomach clench. He wasn't just getting a job, he was being groomed for leadership, regardless of his qualifications or performance. I first met Ethan during his summer internship 3 years ago. He was polite enough, but there was something in his eyes that bothered me. Not malice exactly, but a kind of casual assumption that the world owed him something. He asked questions that revealed a fundamental misunderstanding of how business actually worked, yet he never seemed embarrassed by his ignorance. "Why do we spend so much time on due diligence?" he asked during one team meeting. "If a company wants to sell, why not just make the deal happen faster?" I remember exchanging glances with my colleagues. Due diligence wasn't bureaucratic busywork, it was the foundation of everything we did. It protected our clients, our company, and our reputation. But Ethan saw it as an obstacle to overcome, rather than a responsibility to embrace. The warning signs were there, scattered throughout conversations and observations over the years. Jonathan's increasing references to keeping the business and the family, the way he'd light up when discussing Ethan's fresh perspective and innovative thinking, the gradual shift from meritocracy to nepotism that I'd been too busy succeeding to fully recognize. The company culture had slowly morphed to accommodate this transition. Long-term employees learned to nod approvingly when family members shared half-baked ideas. Performance metrics became more flexible when applied to Whitfield relatives. The unspoken rule became clear: challenge the family at your own risk. I should have seen it coming. The signs were all there, written in expensive ink on premium paper, framed in gold on Jonathan's office wall. But I was too focused on being excellent at my job to realize that excellence might not be enough to protect me from the inexorable march of dynasty thinking. The Whitfield family had built something impressive, but they'd forgotten the most important lesson their patriarch had taught them: success isn't inherited, it's earned, one deal at a time. The Goldstone Industries acquisition was supposed to be the crown jewel of my career. When the opportunity first landed on my desk 6 months ago, I knew immediately that this wasn't just another deal. This was the kind of transformational acquisition that could reshape both companies and cement my reputation as one of the industry's elite dealmakers. Goldstone Industries was a family-owned manufacturing conglomerate with facilities across the Southeast. Founded in 1963 by Thomas Goldstone, the company had grown from a small metal fabrication shop into a diversified industrial powerhouse, with annual revenues exceeding $1.2 billion. They manufactured everything from automotive components to aerospace parts, with long-term contracts with major corporations and government agencies. The complexity of the deal was staggering. Goldstone operated in 14 different industrial sectors, each with its own regulatory requirements, union contracts, and market dynamics. They owned 47 manufacturing facilities, held patents on 36 proprietary processes, and employed over 8,000 people across 7 states. The environmental compliance alone required a team of specialists and months of assessment. But what made this deal truly challenging wasn't the technical complexity, it was the human element. Thomas Goldstone was 74 years old and had no children. Interested in continuing the business, his daughter was a pediatric surgeon in California, and his son ran a nonprofit in Vermont. After 5 decades of building something meaningful, Thomas was facing the heartbreaking reality that his life's work would need new stewardship. I spent 3 months just earning Thomas's trust. I visited every major facility, met with plant managers, talked to longtime employees, and studied the company's culture from the inside out. I learned that Thomas still walked the factory floors every morning, that he knew the names of employees, children, and that he'd never laid off a single worker during the 2008 recession. This wasn't just a business transaction, it was a man's legacy searching for the right home. The financial projections were equally complex. Goldstone's revenue streams were diversified but cyclical, tied to industries ranging from construction to defense contracting. The company had weathered multiple economic downturns by maintaining strong cash reserves and avoiding excessive debt. But their equipment was aging and several facilities needed significant capital investment. My analysis suggested that the right buyer could unlock tremendous value through strategic modernization while preserving the company's core strengths. The key was finding a buyer who understood that Goldstone's greatest asset wasn't just its manufacturing capabilities. It was the institutional knowledge and craftsmanship culture that Thomas had cultivated over decades. After extensive research and networking, I identified Meridian Capital's ideal buyer, Pinnacle Manufacturing Group, a holding company specializing in American industrial businesses. Pinnacle had the financial resources for necessary upgrades, the operational expertise to improve efficiency, and, most importantly, a track record of preserving company cultures during transitions. The preliminary negotiations were delicate. Thomas wanted assurances about employee retention, facility preservation, and continuation of the company's community involvement programs. Pinnacle's executives understood that they weren't just buying assets, they were becoming stewards of a community institution. I crafted a deal structure that addressed everyone's concerns. The purchase price was $847 million, with performance-based earnouts that could increase the total to $920 million if certain operational milestones were achieved. The agreement included binding commitments about employment levels, facility investments, and community engagement. The due diligence process required coordination between dozens of specialists, environmental consultants, regulatory attorneys, financial auditors, and operational experts. Every detail had to be perfect, because the deal would be closely scrutinized by regulators, union representatives, and industry analysts. I maintained detailed documentation of every conversation, every decision, and every strategic consideration. My leather-bound notebook became a repository of insights about client preferences, regulatory requirements, and potential deal breakers. This wasn't just good practice, it was essential for navigating a transaction of this magnitude. The final negotiations were scheduled for early November. Both sides had invested millions in preparation, and the closing was expected to generate $31 million in fees for Meridian Capital. This single deal would represent nearly 40% of my annual production and establish me as one of the premier dealmakers. In the industry, everything was perfectly aligned. The buyers were committed, the sellers were ready, and the terms were fair to everyone involved. After 6 months of meticulous preparation, I was confident that the Goldstone acquisition would be remembered as a textbook example of how complex deals should be handled. I had no idea that I was about to be removed from my own masterpiece. The call came on a Tuesday morning in late October. Jonathan's assistant, Margaret, phoned with that overly cheerful tone that usually preceded bad news. "Mr. Whitfield would like to see you in his office at 10:30, she chirped. "He has something exciting to discuss about the Goldstone deal." Exciting. The word should have been a red flag, but I was too focused on the final preparation stages to read the subtext. I assumed he wanted to discuss the closing timeline or perhaps offer congratulations on the successful negotiations. I'd been working 16-hour days for the past month, and a moment of recognition felt well-deserved. I knocked on Jonathan's door at exactly 10:30, my arms full of updated financial projections and regulatory compliance documents. The office smelled like expensive leather and fresh coffee, a stark contrast to the chaos of deal-making that had consumed my life for the past 6 months. "Rachel, come in, Jonathan said, gesturing to the chair across from his massive mahogany desk. His smile was broader than usual, but there was something unsettling about it, like a politician delivering bad news to constituents while maintaining plausible deniability. "I've been thinking about the Goldstone acquisition," he began, settling back in his chair with the confidence of someone who'd never doubted his own authority. "You've done incredible work getting us to this point. Really, just outstanding preparation and relationship building." I felt a flutter of pride mixed with wariness. Jonathan wasn't typically generous with praise unless he wanted something in return. "But I've been concerned about the workload you've been carrying," he continued, his tone shifting to something that might have been mistaken for paternal concern. 6 months of intensive work. All those late nights, the travel, the stress. You've been burning the candle at both ends, and I think it's time we gave you a well-deserved break." The words hit me like cold water. A break. 3 weeks before, the most important closing of my career, I leaned forward, trying to process what I was hearing. "I don't understand," I said carefully. "The deal is progressing perfectly. Thomas trusts our team, Pinnacle is committed, and we're on track for a November closing. Why would I need a break now?" Jonathan's smile widened, but his eyes remained calculating. "Because I've decided to give my son Ethan the opportunity to take point on this transaction. Fresh eyes, new energy, innovative thinking. I think you'll bring a perspective that could really enhance the final negotiations." The room seemed to tilt. I gripped the arms of my chair, feeling like I was falling. Even though I was sitting still, "Jonathan, with all due respect, this deal is incredibly complex. The relationships I've built with Thomas and his team are crucial too. Are you suggesting that Ethan isn't capable of handling this responsibility?" The question came out sharper than Jonathan probably intended, revealing the defensiveness beneath his polished exterior. I chose my words carefully. "I'm suggesting that changing leadership 3 weeks before closing introduces unnecessary risk. The clients know me, trust me, and expect me to shepherd this deal through the final stages." Jonathan waved dismissively. "Ethan will do fine. He's been observing the process. He understands the key elements, and frankly, I think his Harvard MBA perspective might help us identify optimization opportunities that experience might have overlooked." The insult was subtle but unmistakable. 8 years of proven results were being dismissed in favor of theoretical knowledge and family connections. I felt anger rising in my chest, but I forced myself to remain professional. "When do you want to make this transition?" I asked, my voice steady despite the storm of emotions threatening to overwhelm me today. "Actually, I've already scheduled a team meeting for this afternoon to announce the change. I want you there to show your support for Ethan's leadership, and to help with the knowledge transfer over the next few days." Knowledge transfer. As if 6 months of complex relationship building and strategic planning could be downloaded like a computer file. As if the trust I'd earned with Thomas Goldstone could be casually transferred to someone he'd never met. I sat in silence for a moment, processing the magnitude of what was happening. My career-defining deal was being handed to a 22-year-old with no experience, no relationships, and no understanding of what it took to close a transaction of this magnitude. "I need you to understand," Jonathan continued, apparently interpreting my silence as acceptance. "This isn't a reflection on your capabilities. You're still one of our most valuable team members. But leadership development is crucial for our company's future, and I need to give Ethan opportunities to prove himself." The patronizing tone was almost more insulting than the decision itself. I was being replaced by nepotism, and I was supposed to be grateful for the opportunity to watch my life's work potentially crumble in inexperienced hands. "I understand," I said finally, though I understood nothing except that my world had just shifted beneath my feet as I walked back to my office. I passed the conference room where Margaret was already setting up for the afternoon meeting. The agenda was printed and ready, with my name crossed out and Ethan Whitfield, lead negotiator, written in its place. The foundation I'd built over 8 years was cracking, and I was about to discover just how little job security actually meant in a family business. The team meeting that afternoon was surreal. I watched my colleagues' faces as Jonathan announced that his son would be taking over the Goldstone acquisition. The silence was deafening. Seasoned professionals who understood exactly what this decision meant, but corporate politics demanded they nod approvingly. "I'm excited to work with all of you," Ethan said, standing at the head of the table with unearned confidence. "I think we can bring some fresh energy to this deal and maybe streamline some of the processes that have been, shall we say, a bit overcomplicated." Overcomplicated. 6 months of meticulous preparation were being dismissed by someone who'd never closed a deal larger than his college tuition payment. After the meeting, Ethan approached me. "Rachel, I really appreciate all the groundwork you've laid. I'm hoping we can work together to make this transition as smooth as possible." His Harvard MBA diploma was prominently displayed behind his temporary desk, still fresh from the framer. The leather was so new it hadn't developed the patina that comes from years of meaningful work. "The relationships with Thomas and his team are particularly important," I said carefully. "They've been burned by investment banks before, so trust is crucial." Ethan nodded dismissively. "Right, trust. Got it. But I think they'll respond well to a more direct approach. Sometimes too much relationship building can actually slow things down." I felt my stomach drop. The relationships I'd carefully cultivated weren't just nice-to-haves, they were the foundation of the entire deal. Thomas had specifically told me that most buyers treated his company like a commodity rather than a legacy. "Ethan, Thomas is selling his life's work. This isn't just a financial transaction. It's about finding the right steward for something he's spent 5 decades building." "I understand that," Ethan replied, though his tone suggested he found this perspective quaint rather than crucial. "But at the end of the day, it's still a business deal. If the numbers work, everything else will fall into place." The generational divide was immediately apparent. Ethan saw complexity as inefficiency rather than recognizing that trust, legacy, and human relationships couldn't be reduced to spreadsheet formulas. "What's your timeline for the final negotiations?" I asked. "I'm thinking we can probably wrap this up in the next week or two," he said casually. I've reviewed the key terms, and it seems pretty straightforward. Price, timeline, basic warranties. I don't see why we need to drag this out much longer. I stared at him. The deal had dozens of moving parts: regulatory approvals, environmental assessments, union negotiations, financing arrangements, and complex earn-out structures. The idea that it could be wrapped up in a week showed a fundamental misunderstanding. There are still several regulatory hurdles, I said carefully. The EPA review hasn't been completed and we're waiting on approval from the Committee on Foreign Investment. Ethan waved dismissively. Regulatory stuff is just paperwork. Our lawyers can handle that. I'm more interested in the big picture. Strategy. This was the moment I realized we were heading for disaster. Regulatory compliance wasn't just paperwork, it was the foundation of everything we were building. One missed filing, one overlooked requirement, and the entire deal could collapse. I'd be happy to walk you through the regulatory timeline, I offered. That's okay, Ethan interrupted. I prefer to learn by doing. I think sometimes too much preparation can actually limit your ability to think creatively about solutions. I watched this young man dismiss months of careful work as excessive preparation. His confidence was breathtaking in its naivety. He truly believed that intelligence and family connections could substitute for experience and institutional knowledge. What about the client presentation next week? I asked. Thomas is expecting a comprehensive update on the closing timeline and final terms. I'll handle it, Ethan said, already turning back to his computer. I'm putting together a presentation that should really impress him. I think we've been a bit too conservative in our approach. As I walked back to my office, I felt like I was watching a slow-motion car crash. Every instinct I'd developed over 8 years of deal-making was screaming warnings, but I was powerless to stop what was about to happen. That evening, I stayed, late organizing my files and notes, hoping to create some roadmap that might help Ethan navigate the complexities ahead. But as I looked at my leather-bound notebook filled with months of insights, relationship notes, and strategic observations, I realized that experience couldn't be transferred through documentation. The Goldstone acquisition required more than intelligence and confidence. It required wisdom, patience, and the kind of trust that could only be earned through years of proving your worth. Ethan was about to learn that some lessons can't be taught in business school. The next morning, I arrived with my leather-bound notebook and 6 months of organized documentation. If I was going to be forced out of my own deal, I was determined to give Ethan every possible advantage. My professional integrity demanded nothing less. I found Ethan in the conference room, surrounded by printed emails and financial projections I'd prepared. He looked up with slight irritation, as if my presence was an interruption rather than a lifeline. I thought we could go through the key relationships and critical deadlines, I said. There are some nuances about Thomas's decision-making process that might not be obvious from documentation. Ethan glanced at his watch. Sure, but let's keep it focused. I have a call with the Pinnacle team in an hour, and I want to discuss some strategic modifications to the deal structure. Strategic modifications. The phrase made my chest tighten. This deal had been calibrated over months of negotiations. Every term had been negotiated with surgical precision. The idea of modifications at this stage was terrifying. What kind of modifications? I asked. I think we've been too conservative with the earn-out structure, Ethan said, pulling up a spreadsheet. I've run some models, and I think we can push for more aggressive performance targets that would increase the total deal value. I stared at the screen, heart sinking. The earn-out structure had been one of the most delicate negotiations in the entire deal. Thomas was already nervous about tying part of his payout to future performance metrics. Pushing for more aggressive targets would likely kill the deal entirely. Ethan, the current earn-out structure took weeks to negotiate, I said carefully. Thomas was initially resistant to any performance-based payments. The current terms represent a compromise that both sides can live with. But that's exactly the problem, Ethan replied. We're leaving money on the table. If Pinnacle is confident about the company's future performance, they should be willing to pay more for better results. I opened my notebook to where I'd documented Thomas's concerns. During our third meeting, Thomas had mentioned he'd been burned by earn-out provisions in a previous deal. His words were, "I'm not interested in gambling with my retirement." Ethan glanced at the notes but didn't seem impressed. That was months ago. People change their minds when they see better terms. The casualness with which he dismissed months of relationship building was breathtaking. I tried a different approach. What about the regulatory timeline? I asked. The EPA review is still pending, and we're waiting on 3 different state approvals. The current closing date assumes everything goes smoothly. Regulatory stuff is predictable, Ethan said dismissively. Our lawyers say it's just a matter of filing the right paperwork. I think we can accelerate the timeline by at least 2 weeks. I felt like I was speaking a foreign language. Regulatory approval wasn't predictable. It was a complex process, involving multiple agencies, each with their own priorities and timelines. The environmental assessment alone typically takes. I began. Rachel, I appreciate the detailed preparation, Ethan interrupted, but I think we need to be more solution. Instead of focusing on why things might go wrong, let's focus on making them go right. There, it was the generational divide that would ultimately doom this deal. Ethan saw my experience as pessimism rather than wisdom. He interpreted careful risk management as negative thinking. I spent the next hour walking him through the client files, trying to convey the nuances of each relationship. Thomas's daughter preferred detailed written communications. The company's CFO was meticulous about financial projections. The plant managers needed regular reassurance about employment stability. Ethan listened politely but impatiently. Occasionally, checking his phone, I could see that he viewed this information as background noise rather than crucial intelligence. The most important thing, I concluded, is that Thomas sees this as more than a financial transaction. He's looking for a buyer who will preserve what he's built. Got it, Ethan said, though his tone suggested he didn't get it at all. Legacy preservation. I can definitely work that into my presentation. Work it into his presentation. As if 5 decades of company culture could be reduced to a PowerPoint slide about legacy preservation. That afternoon, I received an email from Thomas's assistant requesting a call to discuss the recent changes in the Meridian team. The word changes was neutral, but I knew Thomas well enough to recognize concern beneath the diplomatic language. I forwarded the email to Ethan with a note about the importance of addressing Thomas's concerns quickly and thoroughly. His response came back within minutes. Thanks, I'll handle it. 3 words that captured everything wrong with this transition. No acknowledgement of the relationship complexities, no request for background information, no recognition that this call could make or break the entire deal. As I sat in my office that evening, looking at the detailed notes I'd compiled over months of careful work, I realized that I wasn't just watching a deal transition. I was watching a masterclass in how inexperience and overconfidence could destroy years of careful work. The foundation I'd built was about to be tested by someone who didn't understand why foundations mattered in the first place. The first red flag appeared within 48 hours. I was reviewing emails when I noticed a document from Ethan labeled Goldstone Proposal, Revised Terms V2. My blood ran cold as I opened the file. The revised proposal was everything I'd feared and worse. Ethan had systematically dismantled our carefully negotiated terms in favor of what he called value optimization. The earnout structure had been completely rewritten with performance targets that were not only aggressive but potentially impossible to achieve. The closing timeline had been accelerated by 3 weeks, with no consideration for regulatory approval processes. Most alarmingly, several employee protection clauses that Thomas had specifically requested had been removed entirely. I stared at the document, feeling like I was watching someone dismantle a Swiss watch with a sledgehammer. Every change demonstrated a fundamental misunderstanding of what had made this deal possible. The employment protection clauses were particularly troubling. Thomas had been explicit about his concerns for the 8,000 employees who would be affected by the acquisition. He'd shared stories about workers who'd been with the company for decades, who'd bought homes and raised families in communities that depended on Goldstone's presence. The original agreement included binding commitments about employment levels. For the first 2 years post-acquisition, Ethan had removed these protections, replacing them with vague language about maximizing operational efficiency and right-sizing the workforce. In his cover email to Pinnacle, he'd written, "I believe we can create additional value by giving the acquiring company more flexibility in post-acquisition operations." Additional value, as if the lives and livelihoods of 8,000 people were simply variables in an optimization equation. I immediately called Ethan's office, but his assistant informed me that he was in important meetings all afternoon. I sent an urgent email outlining my concerns about the revised proposal, particularly the employment protection changes and the unrealistic timeline. His response came 3 hours later. "Thanks for the feedback. I've already sent the revised proposal to both sides. I'm confident these changes will accelerate the closing process and increase value for everyone involved." Already sent. The proposal that could potentially destroy 6 months of careful negotiation had already been distributed to Thomas and the Pinnacle team. I felt physically sick. Within hours, the response from Thomas's team confirmed my worst fears. His assistant called requesting an emergency meeting to discuss the substantial changes to the deal terms. The tone in her voice was carefully controlled, but I could hear the underlying concern. "Mr. Goldstone is particularly interested in understanding the rationale behind the employment-related modifications," she said. He was under the impression that these protections were a core component of the agreement. They were a core component. They were the foundation of trust that had made Thomas comfortable with selling his life's work to people he'd never met. Ethan had just dynamited that foundation and expected everyone to be grateful for the efficiency. I forwarded the message to Ethan with a note about the urgency of addressing Thomas's concerns. His response was maddeningly casual. "I'll call him. Tomorrow, I'm sure I can explain the strategic thinking behind the changes." Tomorrow. As if Thomas Goldstone, who'd been carefully considering this decision for months, would be satisfied with a phone call explanation from someone he'd never met about why his core concerns had been dismissed. The situation deteriorated rapidly. Pinnacle's acquisition team, who had spent months building trust with Thomas, were suddenly fielding calls from confused and concerned Goldstone executives. The carefully orchestrated dance of due diligence and relationship management had been replaced by chaos and confusion. I found myself in an impossible position. I was no longer officially involved in the deal, but I was watching my professional reputation crumble as clients and colleagues tried to understand what had happened to the careful, methodical approach that had defined my career. The breaking point came during a team meeting on Friday afternoon. Ethan was presenting his streamlined approach to the senior partners, using buzzwords like disruption and agile methodology to describe what was essentially the systematic dismantling of months of careful work. "I think we've been too focused on process and not enough on results," he said, clicking through slides that reduced complex relationship dynamics to bullet points. "By simplifying the deal structure and accelerating the timeline, we can create wins for everyone involved." I watched my colleagues' faces as they processed what they were hearing. These were experienced professionals who understood the difference between simplification and oversimplification. They knew that the processes Ethan was dismissing weren't bureaucratic obstacles. They were the foundation of successful deal-making. After the meeting, I lingered in the conference room, staring at the whiteboard where Ethan had outlined his optimization strategy. The irony was crushing. He was optimizing a deal that had already been optimized through months of careful negotiation. He was solving problems that didn't exist while creating problems that didn't need to exist. That evening, I received a call from my contact at Pinnacle. His voice was carefully neutral, but I could hear the concern beneath the professional courtesy. "Rachel, I'm hoping you can help us understand what's happening with the Goldstone deal. We've been working with your team for months, and suddenly we're receiving proposals that seem to contradict everything we've discussed." I was watching my career-defining deal implode in real time, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. The red flags were everywhere, but the person who needed to see them most was too blinded by his own certainty to notice that everything was falling apart. By Monday morning of Ethan's first full week leading the Goldstone acquisition, the carefully constructed deal was already showing cracks. I arrived at the office to find a terse email from Thomas Goldstone's CEO waiting in my inbox, not addressed to me, but forwarded by a concerned colleague. The email was professional but unmistakably cold. "Mr. Whitfield, I am writing to express serious concerns about the recent changes to our acquisition agreement. The revised terms appear to contradict several discussions we've had regarding employee protections and operational continuity. I would appreciate a comprehensive explanation of the rationale behind these modifications." Thomas wasn't just concerned. He was questioning whether Meridian Capital could be trusted to honor commitments. After months of building trust, Ethan had managed to undermine our credibility in less than a week. I immediately forwarded the email to Ethan, with a note about the urgency of addressing Thomas's concerns. His response: "Handled. I'm setting up a call for this afternoon to walk him through the strategic thinking." Strategic thinking, as if there was some master plan behind the chaos he'd created. The call lasted less than 30 minutes, a bad sign for a relationship built on patience and careful dialogue. When Ethan emerged from the conference room, his expression was troubled for the first time since he'd taken over. "That was interesting," he said, though his tone suggested it had been anything but. "Thomas seems pretty attached to some of these legacy provisions. I think he's having trouble adjusting to a more modern approach." Legacy provisions. Employee protection clauses affecting 8,000 people had been reduced to legacy provisions that needed modernizing. The disconnect between Ethan's perception and reality was staggering. The situation deteriorated rapidly. By Wednesday, we received notification that the EPA had requested additional environmental documentation information that should have been submitted weeks earlier. The delay highlighted the problem with Ethan's accelerated closing schedule. "This is exactly the kind of regulatory delay that slows down deals," Ethan complained during the morning team meeting. "We need to push back on these bureaucratic requirements. Push back on the EPA." I exchanged glances with my colleagues, seeing the same mixture of horror and disbelief reflected in their faces. Thursday brought news that made my stomach drop. Pinnacle's financing team had requested a meeting to discuss recent developments in the deal structure. In acquisition financing, this kind of request was never good news. The meeting was scheduled for Friday morning, and I could see the stress starting to show on Ethan's face. His usual confidence was being replaced by something that looked suspiciously like panic. "I don't understand why everyone is making this so complicated," he said, during our team check-in. "The fundamentals of the deal haven't changed. We're still buying the same company for basically the same price." The fundamentals hadn't changed, but everything else had: the trust relationships, the regulatory timeline, the employee protections. All of the elements that made the deal possible had been systematically undermined. Friday morning's meeting with Pinnacle was a disaster. I wasn't included, but I could hear Ethan's voice rising as he tried to explain why his changes were actually improvements. The conversation lasted over an hour, and when it ended, Ethan's face was pale. "They're having second thoughts about the timeline," he reported to the senior partners. "They think we're moving too fast, given the regulatory uncertainties." But the worst was yet to come. That afternoon, I received a call from Thomas's daughter, who served as an unofficial advisor on the acquisition. Her voice was tight with controlled anger. "Rachel, I need to understand what's happening with this deal. My father is questioning everything now. He feels like the people he trusted have been replaced by someone who doesn't understand what this company means to our family." I found myself defending a strategy I'd had no role in creating. "Dr. Goldstone, there's been a leadership transition on our team. Ethan Whitfield is now handling the acquisition." "My father mentioned that," she replied. "But he's never met this person, and suddenly all of the commitments you made about employee protection and operational continuity are being questioned. Is this how Meridian Capital normally operates?" The question challenged not just the current disaster, but my professional reputation and the company's integrity. I'd spent years building trust with clients like Thomas, and now that trust was being systematically destroyed after the call ended. I sat in my office staring at an email notification that had just arrived. It was from Thomas Goldstone himself, copied to the entire Meridian team, with a subject line that made my heart sink. "Serious concerns about acquisition process." The email was brief but devastating. "I am writing to express my profound disappointment in the recent changes to our acquisition agreement. The revised terms appear to contradict assurances that were made during months of careful negotiations. I am requesting a formal meeting to address these concerns, as they call into question whether this acquisition should proceed." I immediately forwarded the email to Ethan, but his response suggested he still didn't grasp the magnitude of what was happening. "I'll schedule a meeting for next week. I'm confident we can address his concerns and get this deal back on track." Back on track. The deal wasn't off track. It was derailed, and the wreckage was spreading across months of careful work and professional relationships that had taken years to build. The first week of Ethan's leadership had turned a carefully orchestrated acquisition into chaos of misunderstandings, missed deadlines, and damaged relationships, and we were only getting started. The following Monday brought the news I'd been dreading but expecting. Margaret knocked on my office door with an expression that conveyed the gravity of what she was about to deliver. "Rachel, you need to see this immediately," she said, handing me a formal letter that had arrived by courier 30 minutes earlier. The letterhead was from Goldstone Industries' legal department, and the subject line left no room for interpretation. "Notice of intent to terminate acquisition agreement." My hands trembled as I read the carefully worded document that represented the collapse of everything I'd worked toward. The letter was devastating in its precision. Thomas's legal team had documented every deviation from the original agreement, every missed deadline, and every communication failure since Ethan took over. They'd built an airtight case for why Meridian Capital had materially breached the terms, due to substantial changes in deal structure, failure to meet agreed-upon timelines, and lack of consistency in communication from the Meridian team. Goldstone Industries is exercising its right to terminate this agreement unless these issues are resolved within 72 hours. The letter stated 70-2 hours, 3 days to save a deal that had taken 6 months to construct, and less than 2 weeks to destroy. I immediately called Ethan's office, but was told he was in an emergency meeting with his father. The emergency, I realized, was the recognition that the Whitfield family's experiment in nepotism was about to cost the company its biggest deal of the year. 20 minutes later, Ethan appeared in my doorway. His usual confidence had been replaced by something that looked suspiciously like panic. His Harvard MBA diploma, so prominently displayed behind his desk, seemed to mock the reality of what inexperience could accomplish. "I need your help," he said, the words clearly difficult for him to speak. "This whole situation has gotten out of hand, and I think you have the best relationship with Thomas." "Out of hand?" as if the systematic destruction of 6 months of careful work had been an accidental series of events rather than the predictable result of replacing competence with connections. What specifically do you need from me? I asked, though I already knew the answer. I need you to call Thomas and explain that the changes were just preliminary ideas that were committed to the original terms, and that we can get this deal back on track. Back on track. The metaphor was apt, but Ethan still didn't seem to understand that the train hadn't just derailed, it had crashed into a mountain of damaged relationships and broken trust. Ethan, this isn't just about the deal terms, I said carefully. Thomas has lost confidence in our ability to honor our commitments. He's questioning whether Meridian Capital can be trusted to follow through on anything we promise. But we can fix this, Ethan insisted. We can go back to the original agreement, restore the employment protections, adjust the timeline, whatever it takes. The naivety was heartbreaking. He still believed that business relationships operated like software programs that you could simply restore from a backup and pretend the crash had never happened. Trust isn't something you can fix with revised terms, I explained. Thomas has been burned by investment banks before. When he sees this kind of inconsistency, it confirms his worst fears about working with people who don't understand what his company means to him. I could see the reality starting to dawn on Ethan's face. This wasn't a negotiation problem that could be solved with better PowerPoint presentations or more aggressive terms. This was a human relationship that had been damaged by carelessness and overconfidence. Will you make the call? He asked finally. I looked at this young man who had been handed an opportunity he wasn't prepared for and realized that I was facing my own moment of truth. I could try to save the deal, restore the relationships, and paper over the disaster that had occurred. Or I could let the natural consequences of poor decision-making play out. I'll make the call, I said, but I need you to understand that this conversation is going to be difficult. Thomas isn't just angry about the deal. Terms he's disappointed in us as people. He trusted us with his life's work, and we've given him reasons to question that trust. That afternoon, I sat in my office preparing for what might be the most important phone call of my career. I had my leather notebook open to the pages where I'd documented Thomas's concerns, preferences, and fears. I had the original agreement, the revised terms, and the termination notice spread across my desk. But most importantly, I had a decision to make about what I owed to Ethan, to Jonathan, to the company, and to my own professional integrity. The call was scheduled for 4 p.m. As I dialed Thomas's number, I realized that I was about to discover whether 8 years of building trust and competence could overcome 2 weeks of demonstrating the opposite. Thomas answered on the second ring, his voice careful and controlled. Rachel, I was hoping you'd call. I assume you've seen our letter. I have, I replied, and I want to apologize for the confusion and inconsistency you've experienced. You deserved better from us. There was a long pause before Thomas responded. Rachel, I've been in business for 50 years. I've seen deals fall apart for all kinds of reasons. Financing issues, regulatory problems, market changes, but I've never seen anything like what happened here. His words carried the weight of disappointment that went beyond business. This wasn't just about a failed transaction, it was about the violation of trust between people who had committed to working together in good faith. I understand your concerns, I said, and I want to discuss whether there's a path forward that might address them. Is there? Thomas asked. Because from where I sit, it looks like your company makes promises it can't keep, and commitments it's willing to change whenever it's convenient. The question hung in the air like a challenge. I was holding the termination notice in my hand, knowing that I had 72 hours to save not just a deal, but the professional reputation I'd spent 8 years building. This was the point of no return, and I had to choose between loyalty to a company that had sidelined me and integrity to a client who had trusted me. The call with Thomas lasted 47 minutes. By the time I hung up, I knew that the Goldstone acquisition was beyond saving. I'm sorry, Rachel, Thomas had said near the end. I know this isn't your fault, but I can't risk my employees' futures and my company's legacy on a firm that changes its commitments as casually as it changes its leadership. The finality in his voice was unmistakable. This wasn't a negotiating position, it was a decision reached after careful consideration. I immediately called Ethan to deliver the news. His response was exactly what I expected. Disbelief followed by anger, followed by desperate attempts to find someone else to blame. This is ridiculous, he said. We can give him everything he wants. Why won't he just accept that and move forward? I tried to explain one final time that business relationships weren't transactions that could be reversed with better terms. But Ethan's worldview didn't include the possibility that confidence and good intentions weren't sufficient to overcome damaged trust. The official termination notice arrived the next morning. It was brief, professional, and devastating. Goldstone Industries hereby formally terminates the acquisition agreement with Meridian Capital, effective immediately. Within hours, the news was spreading through the industry. The headline made my stomach drop: Goldstone Industries terminates $847 million acquisition deal with Meridian Capital. The carefully constructed deal that had taken 6 months to build had become a cautionary tale about how quickly trust could be destroyed. The impact on Meridian Capital was immediate and severe. The company's stock price dropped 12% in the first hour of trading. The $31 million in expected fees had not only disappeared, they'd been replaced by much larger costs of damaged reputation and lost credibility. But the human cost was more devastating than the financial impact. I watched my colleagues processing the reality that months of their work had been destroyed by 2 weeks of poor decisions. These were experienced professionals who had invested their time, expertise, and reputations in a deal that was now being dissected by industry observers. The emergency board meeting was called for Thursday afternoon. I wasn't invited, but I could see board members arriving throughout the day, their expressions grim. The Whitfield family's experiment in nepotism was about to face its first serious scrutiny. Jonathan emerged from the boardroom looking like he'd aged a decade in a single afternoon. His usual confidence had been replaced by something that looked suspiciously like panic. The board had asked pointed questions about the decision-making process that had led to this disaster. That evening, I received an unexpected call from my contact at Pinnacle Manufacturing. "Rachel, I'm calling to let you know that we're still interested in the Goldstone acquisition, but we'll be working with a different investment bank. Thomas has lost confidence in Meridian's ability to manage this process." The words hit me like a physical blow. Not only had we lost the deal, but we'd lost it to competitors who would now benefit from months of our preparation and relationship building. The buyers were still committed, the seller was still motivated, and the deal fundamentals were still sound. The only thing that had changed was their confidence in our ability to execute. The next morning brought news that completed our humiliation. The Wall Street Journal had published a detailed analysis of the Goldstone deal collapse, and the article included quotes from industry sources who painted a devastating picture of incompetence and mismanagement. The Goldstone acquisition appeared to be a textbook example of how experienced dealmakers build trust and navigate complex negotiations, the article stated. The decision to replace seasoned leadership with inexperienced management during the final stages represents a fundamental misunderstanding of how high-stakes acquisitions actually work. As I sat in my office reading the article, I realized that I was witnessing something larger than a single failed transaction. I was watching the real-time consequences of a system that valued connections over competence, assumptions over achievement, and privilege over performance. The $847 million collapse wasn't just a business failure, it was a human failure. It was what happened when people who had never experienced real consequences for their decisions were given the power to make decisions that affected thousands of lives and millions of dollars. The chart on my computer screen showed Meridian's stock price continuing to fall, but the financial impact was just the beginning. The real damage was to the trust and credibility that had taken years to build and mere weeks to destroy. I closed my laptop and looked out at the city skyline, realizing that everything I thought I knew about job security, professional competence, and meritocracy had just been shattered by the reality of how business actually worked when family connections trumped everything else. The deal was dead, but the lessons were just beginning. To let you know that we're still interested in the Goldstone acquisition, but we'll be working with a different investment bank. Thomas has lost confidence in Meridian's ability to manage this process. The words hit me like a physical blow. Not only had we lost the deal, but we'd lost it to competitors who would now benefit from months of our preparation and relationship building. The buyers were still committed, the seller was still motivated, and the deal fundamentals were still sound. The only thing that had changed was their confidence in our ability to execute. "I understand," I replied, though I understood nothing except that I was watching my career-defining opportunity disappear because of decisions I'd played no role in making. The next morning brought the news that completed our humiliation. The Wall Street Journal had published a detailed analysis of the Goldstone deal collapse, and the article included quotes from industry sources who painted a devastating picture of incompetence and mismanagement. The Goldstone acquisition appeared to be a textbook example of how experienced dealmakers build trust and navigate complex negotiations, the article stated. The decision to replace seasoned leadership with inexperienced management during the final stages of the deal represents fundamental misunderstanding of how high-stakes acquisitions actually work. The article didn't mention Ethan by name, but anyone in the industry would understand exactly what had happened. The story would follow him for years, and by extension, it would follow the entire Meridian team that had worked on the deal. As I sat in my office reading the article, I realized that I was witnessing something larger than a single failed transaction. I was watching the real-time consequences of a system that valued connections over competence, assumptions over achievement, and privilege over performance. The $847 million collapse wasn't just a business failure, it was a human failure. It was what happened when people who had never experienced real consequences for their decisions were given the power to make decisions that affected thousands of lives and millions of dollars. The chart on my computer screen showed Meridian's stock price continuing to fall, but the financial impact was just the beginning. The real damage was to the trust and credibility that had taken years to build and mere weeks to destroy. I closed my laptop and looked out at the city skyline, realizing that everything I thought I knew about job security, professional competence, and meritocracy had just been shattered by the reality of how business actually worked when family connections trumped everything else. The deal was dead, but the lessons were just beginning. The emergency board meeting reconvened on Friday morning, and this time I was summoned to attend. Margaret delivered the message with formal courtesy that suggested I was being called as a witness rather than a participant. The board would like to hear your perspective on the Goldstone acquisition, she said. They're particularly interested in understanding the timeline of events that led to the termination. I arrived at the boardroom 15 minutes early, carrying a folder containing 6 months of documentation, correspondence, and detailed notes. The board meeting minutes from previous sessions were scattered across the conference table, and I could see my name highlighted throughout the documents. The board members filed in with expressions ranging from concerned to furious. These were successful business leaders who understood the difference between acceptable risk and reckless incompetence. The $847 million collapse had damaged Meridian's reputation in ways that would take years to repair. Chairman Robert Hayes called the meeting to order with unusual formality. We're here to conduct a comprehensive review of the Goldstone acquisition process. We need to understand how a deal that appeared to be progressing smoothly could collapse so completely in such a short time frame. Jonathan sat at the far end of the table, his usual commanding presence diminished by the weight of what had transpired. For the first time since I'd known him, he looked uncertain, even defensive. The questions began immediately. Board member Patricia Chen asked me to walk through the original deal structure and explain how the client relationships had been developed. I opened my folder and methodically explained the 6-month process of building trust, negotiating terms, and navigating regulatory requirements. The employment protection clauses were particularly important to Mr. Goldstone, I explained. He'd been approached by numerous potential buyers over the years, but most treated the acquisition as a pure financial transaction. Our approach was different because we recognized that he was selling his life's work, and these employment protections were included in the final negotiated terms, asked board member David Sterling. Yes, they were considered non-negotiable by the client. Mr. Goldstone specifically said that he wouldn't approve any deal that didn't include binding commitments about employment levels for the first 2 years post-acquisition. The questions continued for over an hour, methodically reconstructing the original deal structure and the client relationships that had made it possible. I could see the board members taking detailed notes, particularly when I explained the regulatory timeline and the delicate balance of stakeholder interests. Then Chairman Hayes asked the question I'd been dreading. Ms. Morgan, can you explain the circumstances that led to the change in leadership on this deal? I glanced at Jonathan, who was studying the table as if it contained the secrets of the universe. This was the moment where corporate politics would collide with professional truth. Mr. Whitfield informed me that he wanted to give his son Ethan an opportunity to lead the final negotiations, I said carefully. He felt that Ethan's perspective might enhance the deal. And what was your assessment of this decision? Asked Patricia Chen. The question hung in the air like a challenge. I could provide a diplomatic non-answer that protected everyone's feelings. Or I could tell the truth about what I'd witnessed. I expressed concerns about changing leadership during the final stages of such a complex transaction, I said. The client relationships were built on trust and consistency. Mr. Goldstone had specifically mentioned that he'd been burned by investment banks that changed their approach midstream. Did you communicate these concerns to Mr. Whitfield? Asked Chairman Hayes. I did. I explained that the timing was particularly problematic because we were dealing with regulatory deadlines and the client was already nervous about the acquisition process. The room fell silent. I could see the board members processing the implications of what I'd said. Jonathan's decision to replace experienced leadership with his inexperienced son during the most critical phase wasn't just poor judgment, it was a violation of fiduciary responsibility. Mr. Whitfield, Chairman Hayes said, turning to Jonathan, what was your rationale for making this change at such a critical juncture? Jonathan's response was everything I expected and feared. I believed that Ethan's fresh perspective and innovative thinking could add value to the final negotiations. Rachel had done excellent work in the preparation phase, but I felt that new leadership might help us optimize the deal structure. Optimize the deal structure, the phrase sounded even more hollow in the formal setting of a board meeting, where millions of dollars in losses demanded better explanations than buzzwords about optimization. And what was the result of this optimization? Asked David Sterling, his tone suggesting he already knew the answer. The question forced Jonathan to confront the reality that his decision had cost the company not just immediate fees, but years of reputation building and client trust. The board meeting minutes would record that the CEO's attempt to advance his son's career had resulted in the largest deal collapse in the company's history. The client became concerned about the changes in approach, Jonathan admitted. Unfortunately, we were unable to address those concerns in time to preserve the relationship. Unable to address those concerns, the euphemism was remarkable in its inadequacy. We hadn't been unable to address Thomas's concerns. Weeds created and amplified them through 2 weeks of incompetent decision-making. As the meeting concluded, I realized that I'd just participated in something historic. For the first time in the company's history, the board was formally documenting the failure of the Whitfield family's assumption that blood relationships trumped professional competence. The reckoning had begun in the carefully maintained fiction that nepotism was just another form of succession. Planning was about to collapse under the weight of an $847 million reality check. The weekend following the board meeting was the longest of my professional life. I spent Saturday and Sunday in my home office, staring at 6 months of documentation and wondering whether I had the courage to do what my conscience was telling me was necessary. The decision crystallized on Sunday evening as I was reviewing the original emails where Thomas had expressed his concerns about working with investment banks. His words haunted me. I've been burned before by people who promise one thing and deliver another. I need to work with someone I can trust completely. I'd built that trust over months of careful relationship building, and I'd watched it be destroyed in weeks by someone who didn't understand its value. The question now was whether I would stand by silently while the narrative was shaped by people who had the most to lose from the truth. Monday morning, I requested a meeting with Chairman Hayes. His assistant scheduled it for Tuesday afternoon, which gave me 24 hours to prepare the most important presentation of my career. I spent that time creating what I privately called the Whistleblower Report, a comprehensive documentation of everything that had gone wrong with the Goldstone acquisition and why. It wasn't enough to simply describe the failure. I needed to demonstrate the systematic nature of the problems and the predictable consequences of replacing competence with connections. The report was organized chronologically, starting with the original deal structure and client relationships, then documenting each decision that had undermined the foundation we'd built. I included email correspondence, meeting notes, and detailed analysis of how each change had contributed to the eventual collapse. Most importantly, I documented the pattern of nepotism that had enabled this disaster. The Goldstone acquisition wasn't an isolated incident. It was the inevitable result of a company culture that prioritized family connections over professional competence. Tuesday afternoon, I sat across from Chairman Hayes in his office. My report spread across the conference table between us. He'd spent the morning reviewing the materials I'd provided, and his expression suggested he understood the gravity of what we were discussing. "This is a serious allegation," he said, his voice carefully controlled. "You're suggesting that the failure of the Goldstone acquisition was not an isolated incident, but part of a broader pattern of poor decision-making. I'm suggesting that you can't understand what happened with Goldstone without understanding the culture that made it possible." I replied, "Ethan wasn't given this opportunity because he was the most qualified person for the job. He was given it because he was Jonathan's son." Chairman Hayes leaned back in his chair, studying the documents in front of him. "You've documented several instances where family connections appeared to influence personnel decisions. What do you think the board should do with this information?" The question was both an invitation and a test. I could recommend mild reforms and policy changes that would allow everyone to save face. Or I could push for the kind of accountability that would actually prevent future disasters. "I think the board needs to decide whether Meridian Capital is a professional services firm or a family business," I said, "because the two models are fundamentally incompatible when you're managing other people's life savings and legacy companies." That afternoon, Chairman Hayes called an emergency board meeting. I wasn't invited to attend, but I could see the board members arriving throughout the day, their expressions grim and their conversations hushed. The meeting lasted for hours. I stayed late, ostensibly to catch up on other work, but really to observe the aftermath of what I'd set in motion. The parking garage was nearly empty when I finally saw board members leaving, their body language suggesting that difficult decisions had been made. Wednesday morning brought the first consequences. Jonathan's assistant called to inform me that he'd requested a meeting for later that day. The tone in her voice suggested this wouldn't be a pleasant conversation. I arrived at Jonathan's office to find him looking older than I'd ever seen him. The confident executive who'd casually dismissed months of careful work had been replaced by someone who was clearly struggling with the reality of what his decisions had cost. "I understand you've been sharing your concerns with the board," he said, his voice carefully controlled but tinged with something that might have been disappointment or anger. "I shared my professional assessment of what happened with the Goldstone acquisition," I replied. "The board asked for my perspective, and I provided it." "Your perspective?" Jonathan repeated, which apparently includes the suggestion that my decision to involve Ethan was motivated by nepotism rather than business judgment. The word hung in the air between us like an accusation. Nepotism was the truth that everyone in the company understood, but no one was supposed to acknowledge directly. "I documented the decision-making process and its consequences," I said. "The board can draw their own conclusions about the motivations involved." Jonathan stood up and walked to the window, his back to me as he spoke. "You know, Rachel, I've always respected your work. You're one of the best deal-makers I've ever worked with, but I'm disappointed that you chose to handle this situation in such a destructive way." Destructive. The word was remarkable in its lack of subtlety. The destruction had already occurred when a $847 million deal collapsed because of poor leadership decisions. I'd simply documented the cause and effect. "I chose to handle it professionally," I replied. "I provided the board with factual information about what happened and why. They asked for my assessment, and I gave it." Jonathan turned back to face me, and I could see the weight of the situation in his eyes. "The board has asked me to consider whether there might be better organizational structures for managing complex transactions going forward." Better organizational structures. The euphemism was elegant, but the meaning was clear. The board was questioning whether the Whitfield family's control over the company was compatible with the kind of professional competence that clients expected. As I left Jonathan's office, I realized that I'd just crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. I'd chosen professional integrity over corporate loyalty, and the consequences would reshape not just my career, but the entire culture of the company. The truth was finally being spoken, and the consequences were just beginning to unfold. The final confrontation came 3 days later, delivered in the form of a resignation letter that I found on my desk Thursday morning. The letterhead was embossed with the Meridian Capital logo, and the signature at the bottom belonged to Jonathan Whitfield. "Effective immediately, I am resigning from my position as Chief Executive Officer of Meridian Capital," the letter stated. "After careful consideration and discussion with the board of directors, I have concluded that new leadership is necessary to restore client confidence and ensure the company's continued success." I read the letter twice, trying to process the magnitude of what had just occurred. The CEO, who had built his career on the assumption that family connections trumped professional competence, had just been forced out by the consequences of his own decisions. The announcement went company-wide. Within an hour, the carefully worded email from Chairman Hayes explained that Jonathan had chosen to pursue new opportunities and that the board would be conducting a comprehensive search for new leadership. The corporate euphemisms couldn't disguise the reality that the Whitfield dynasty had just ended. By noon, the news was spreading through the industry. A CEO resignation following a high-profile deal collapse was significant news in the investment banking world, and the financial press was already speculating about the underlying causes. I was reviewing the morning's emails when Margaret knocked on my door. "Mr. Whitfield would like to see you in his office," she said, her tone suggesting this would be their final interaction. I found Jonathan packing personal items into cardboard boxes, his movements deliberate, but somehow defeated. The family portrait that had dominated his office for years was wrapped in tissue paper, ready for transport to wherever displaced executives go to process their fall from grace. "I wanted to thank you for your years of service," he said without looking up from his packing. "You've been one of our most valuable team members, and I hope you'll continue to find success here." The formality was surreal. We were talking like strangers conducting a business transaction, not like people who had worked together for 8 years and shared the experience of watching a career-defining deal collapse. "I appreciate that," I replied, though I wasn't sure what I was supposed to appreciate about the situation. Jonathan finished packing a box and finally looked directly at me. "I want you to know that I still believe Ethan has tremendous potential. He's young and he made some mistakes, but that doesn't mean he's not capable of learning and growing." The statement hung in the air like a challenge. Even in defeat, Jonathan couldn't quite acknowledge that the problem wasn't Ethan's youth or inexperience. It was the system that had given him authority he hadn't earned and responsibility he couldn't handle. "I'm sure he'll find the right opportunity to develop his skills," I said diplomatically. "What I don't understand," Jonathan continued, is why you felt it was necessary to involve the board in what should have been handled internally. We could have worked through these issues without creating such a public spectacle. There it was, the fundamental disconnect that had made this disaster inevitable. Jonathan still believed that the collapse of an $847 million deal was an internal personnel matter rather than a failure of corporate governance that demanded accountability. The board asked for my assessment of what happened. I said, I provided them with factual information about the decision-making process and its consequences. They drew their own conclusions about what needed to change. Your factual information, Jonathan replied, his tone sharpening slightly, painted a picture of incompetence and nepotism that ignored the broader context of leadership development and family business succession. Leadership development, family business succession. The euphemisms were elegant, but they couldn't change the reality that thousands of jobs and hundreds of millions of dollars had been put at risk to advance the career of someone who wasn't qualified for the responsibility. The broader context, I said carefully, was that client relationships and professional competence were sacrificed for personal considerations. The board understood the implications of that choice. Jonathan closed the box he'd been packing and sealed it with tape. I hope you're satisfied with the outcome, he said, the words carrying an edge of bitterness. You've gotten what you wanted. The end of the Whitfield family's involvement in this company. The accusation was unfair but revealing. In Jonathan's mind, I'd orchestrated his downfall rather than simply documented the consequences of his own decisions. He couldn't accept that. His resignation was the natural result of failed leadership rather than a corporate coup. I didn't want any of this, I replied. I wanted the Goldstone acquisition to succeed. I wanted to build on the relationships and trust we'd developed. I wanted to prove that professional competence and careful preparation could create value for everyone involved. And instead, you've created a situation where nobody wins, Jonathan said, lifting the box and preparing to leave. The deal is dead. My career is over, and you've damaged relationships that took years to build. The conversation was ending the way it had begun, with a fundamental disagreement about cause and effect. Jonathan saw the board's decision as punishment for his attempt to develop his son's career. I saw it as accountability for putting personal interests ahead of professional responsibility. As he walked toward the door, Jonathan paused and turned back one final time. I hope you realize that this won't end here. The industry is small and people remember how these situations are handled. Your reputation will be shaped by how you chose to respond to this challenge. The threat was subtle but unmistakable. In Jonathan's world, loyalty to the company meant loyalty to the family, and my decision to prioritize professional integrity over corporate politics would be remembered as betrayal. I can live with that, I said, surprised by the steadiness in my own voice. My reputation will be based on the work I've done and the results I've delivered. I'm comfortable with that foundation. After Jonathan left, I sat in my office processing what had just occurred. The CEO, who had casually dismissed 8 years of proven competence in favor of family connections, had just been forced to resign by the consequences of his own decisions. The confrontation was over, but the transformation was just beginning. For the first time in the company's history, merit had trumped family connections, and professional competence had been recognized as more valuable than inherited authority. The old system was dying, and something new was about to be born, and people remember how these situations are handled. Your reputation will be shaped by how you chose to respond to this challenge. The threat was subtle but unmistakable. In Jonathan's world, loyalty to the company meant loyalty to the family, and my decision to prioritize professional integrity over corporate politics would be remembered as betrayal. I can live with that, I said, surprised by the steadiness in my own voice. My reputation will be based on the work I've done and the results I've delivered. I'm comfortable with that foundation. After Jonathan left, I sat in my office processing what had just occurred. The CEO, who had casually dismissed 8 years of proven competence in favor of family connections, had just been forced to resign by the consequences of his own decisions. The confrontation was over, but the transformation was just beginning. For the first time in the company's history, merit had trumped family connections, and professional competence had been recognized as more valuable than inherited authority. The old system was dying, and something new was about to be born. The Wall Street Journal article appeared on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks after Jonathan's resignation. The headline made my coffee cup tremble in my hands. When Merit Meets Nepotism, the Meridian Capital Case Study. The article was comprehensive, well-researched, and devastating in its analysis of how family businesses in the financial services industry struggled with succession planning. But what made it particularly powerful was that it had been written by Sarah Martinez, one of the most respected business journalists in the country. The collapse of the Goldstone Industries acquisition offers a textbook example of how nepotism can undermine even the most successful professional services firms. the article began. When Meridian Capital CEO Jonathan Whitfield replaced his star dealmaker with his inexperienced son during the final stages of a $847 million transaction, he created a natural experiment in whether family connections could substitute for professional competence. The experiment, as Sarah Martinez documented with surgical precision, had failed spectacularly. The article included quotes from industry experts, former Meridian employees, and even Thomas Goldstone himself, who had agreed to speak on the record. About his experience with the acquisition process, "I've been in business for 50 years, Thomas was quoted as saying, "I've seen deals succeed and fail for many reasons, but I've never seen a situation where such careful preparation was undermined so quickly by such poor judgment. The person who spent months earning my trust was replaced by someone who seemed to believe that confidence could substitute for competence." The most damaging section focused on the broader implications of the Meridian case for the financial services industry. Sarah Martinez had interviewed dozens of sources who described similar situations where family connections had trumped professional merit, creating risks that extended far beyond individual companies. The Meridian Capital case highlights a fundamental tension in family-owned financial services firms, the article explained. When personal relationships supersede professional competence in high-stakes transactions, the consequences extend beyond the immediate parties to include clients, employees, and market confidence. But what surprised me most was a section near the end that focused specifically on my role in the situation. Someone I suspected it was Chairman Hayes had provided detailed background about my career, my track record, and my decision to document the failures that had led to the deal's collapse. Rachel Morgan, the veteran dealmaker who was replaced by Ethan Whitfield, chose to provide the board with a comprehensive analysis of what had gone wrong, rather than remain silent about the professional failures she had witnessed. The article stated, "Her decision to prioritize client interests and professional integrity over corporate loyalty represents a model for how experienced professionals should respond when personal relationships threaten professional competence." The phrase "professional integrity over corporate loyalty" resonated with me in ways I hadn't expected. For weeks, I'd been questioning whether I'd done the right thing by speaking up. The article suggested that my decision represented something larger than personal vindication. It was about establishing standards for how professionals should respond when competence is subordinated to connections. The industry reaction was swift and largely supportive. By noon, I'd received calls from 3 executive recruiters, 5 former colleagues, and 2 potential clients who had read the article and wanted to discuss potential opportunities. The most meaningful call came from Patricia Chen, the board member who had asked some of the most pointed questions during the emergency meetings. Her voice was warm and congratulatory. "I wanted to thank you for your courage in speaking up about what happened," she said. "It couldn't have been easy to challenge the company's leadership structure, but your willingness to prioritize professional standards over personal comfort made all the difference." "I just documented what happened," I replied. "The board made the difficult decisions." "You did more than document," Patricia said. "You demonstrated that professional competence and client relationships matter more than family connections and corporate politics. That's a lesson this industry needs to learn." The calls continued throughout the day. Former clients reached out to express support and share their own experiences with firms that had prioritized personal relationships over professional competence. Colleagues from other companies offered congratulations and shared stories about similar situations they'd witnessed but hadn't felt empowered to address. The most unexpected call came from Thomas Goldstone himself. His voice was warm and appreciative as he explained why he'd agreed to speak with the Wall Street Journal. "I wanted people to understand that this wasn't about personalities or individual failures," he said. "It was about the importance of trust and competence in professional relationships. What happened at Meridian could happen anywhere that family connections are allowed to override professional merit." That evening, I received an email from someone I hadn't heard from in months, Jennifer Walsh, a former colleague who had left Meridian 2 years earlier to start her own consulting firm. Her message was brief but powerful. "I read the journal article and wanted to thank you for finally saying what needed to be said. I left Meridian because I couldn't watch competence being subordinated to connections anymore. Your courage in speaking up gives me hope that the industry might actually change." The vindication was gratifying, but more importantly, it was educational. The industry was finally having an honest conversation about the costs of nepotism and the importance of professional competence. The conversation that had started with a failed acquisition was evolving into a broader discussion about how professional services firms should be managed and led. The Wall Street Journal article had done more than tell the story of what had happened. At Meridian Capital, it had created a case study that would be used in business schools, discussed in boardrooms, and referenced in succession planning discussions for years to come. The industry had taken notice, and the principles I'd defended were being validated by people who understood the stakes involved. The vindication was complete, but the real work was just beginning. The decision to leave Meridian Capital and start my own firm wasn't difficult, it was inevitable. After the Wall Street Journal article and the industry response to the Goldstone case, I realized that I'd outgrown the constraints of working within someone else's organizational structure. The incorporation papers for Morgan Advisory Services arrived on a Friday morning in early December. The legal documents were straightforward, but they represented something profound. The transformation from employee to entrepreneur, from following someone else's vision to creating my own. I'd spent the previous month quietly reaching out to former clients, industry contacts, and professional relationships I'd built over 8 years of dealmaking. The response was overwhelmingly positive. People who had worked with me understood that my departure from Meridian represented an opportunity to work with someone who prioritized competence over connections. The first major client commitment came from an unexpected source. Thomas Goldstone called on a Tuesday afternoon, his voice carrying the warmth of someone who had been vindicated by subsequent events. "Rachel, I've been thinking about our conversation from a few months ago," he said. "I'm still interested in finding the right buyer for my company, but I want to work with someone I can trust completely. Would you be interested in representing us?" The irony was perfect. The deal that had been destroyed by nepotism and incompetence was being offered to me as the foundation for my new firm. Thomas wasn't just offering a transaction, he was offering redemption. "I'd be honored to represent Goldstone Industries," I replied, feeling the weight of the moment. "But I want to be clear about my approach. This will be about finding the right buyer for your company, not just the highest bidder." "That's exactly why I'm calling you," Thomas said. "I need someone who understands that this is about legacy, not just money." Within a week, I'd signed a representation agreement with Goldstone Industries and begun the process of rebuilding the acquisition opportunity that had been destroyed by poor leadership. But this time I was in complete control of the process, the relationships, and the outcomes. The second major client came from a referral. Patricia Chen, the board member who had supported my decision to speak up about the Meridian failures, recommended me to a technology company that was considering a strategic acquisition. The CEO was impressed by my track record and particularly interested in my approach to managing complex stakeholder relationships. "We've heard about what happened at Meridian," he said during our initial meeting. "We're looking for someone who will prioritize our interests over internal politics. Your reputation for professional integrity is exactly what we need." By January, Morgan Advisory Services had 4 active clients and a growing pipeline of potential opportunities. I'd assembled a small team of experienced professionals who shared my commitment to competence over connections. We operated from a modest office space, but our focus was on delivering results rather than impressing people with expensive overhead. The approach was fundamentally different from what I'd experienced at Meridian. Instead of competing for internal resources and recognition, we focused entirely on client needs and professional excellence. Instead of navigating family dynamics and corporate politics, we made decisions based on what would create the best outcomes for the people who trusted us with their most important transactions. The personal transformation was as significant as the professional change. For the first time in my career, I wasn't trying to prove myself to people who had already decided that family connections mattered more than professional competence. I was building something based on my own values and standards. The validation came in unexpected ways. Former colleagues from Meridian reached out to discuss opportunities to join the new firm. Clients who had worked with me in the past specifically requested my services for new transactions. Industry publications featured articles about the growing trend of experienced professionals leaving established firms to create more merit-based organizations. Most importantly, I was rediscovering the joy of deal-making that had been diminished by months of corporate dysfunction. Every client meeting, every negotiation, every strategic decision was made with the confidence that came from knowing that competence would be rewarded, and results would matter more than relationships. The Goldstone acquisition became the flagship transaction that established Morgan Advisory Services as a serious player in the market. Working directly with Thomas, I was able to rebuild the trust relationships that had been damaged by the Meridian debacle. The new buyer was a strategic acquirer who understood the importance of preserving company culture and employee relationships. The closing took place on a Thursday morning in March. As I watched Thomas sign the final documents, I realized that we'd accomplished something more significant than a successful transaction. We'd demonstrated that professional competence and client relationships could triumph over the kind of dysfunction that had destroyed the original deal. The success of Morgan Advisory Services wasn't just about building a profitable business, it was about creating a model for how professional services firms should operate. Merit-based decision-making, client-focused strategies, and accountability for results became the foundation of everything we did. The transformation was complete. I'd evolved from being a victim of someone else's poor judgment to being the architect of my own professional destiny. The new beginning wasn't just about starting a company, it was about proving that competence, integrity, and client relationships could create sustainable success. The incorporation papers that had arrived on that Friday morning in December represented more than legal documentation. They represented the birth of an organization built on the principles that had been abandoned at Meridian Capital but validated by the industry's response to the entire experience. I was no longer working for someone else's vision of success. I was creating my own, and the foundation was stronger than anything I'd built before. The call came on a Tuesday morning in late spring, almost exactly 1 year after the original Goldstone acquisition had collapsed. Thomas's voice carried the satisfaction of someone who had finally found what he'd been looking for. "Rachel, I'm pleased to inform you that the board has approved the acquisition terms. We'll be moving forward with the Strategic Industries deal." The Goldstone success story had taken on symbolic importance far beyond its financial impact. After the disaster with Meridian Capital, many industry observers had questioned whether the company could ever successfully complete an acquisition. The fact that Thomas had chosen to work with my new firm sent a powerful message about the importance of trust and competence in professional relationships. The final deal terms were everything the original Meridian proposal should have been: fair valuation, comprehensive employee protections, and a structure that respected both the seller's legacy concerns and the buyer's strategic objectives. Strategic Industries, unlike the original buyer, had remained committed throughout the process because they understood they were working with professionals who prioritized client interests over internal politics. "The employment protection clauses you insisted on were crucial to our decision," Thomas continued. "Knowing that our people will be taken care of for the next 3 years gives me confidence that we're doing the right thing." The employment protections had been non-negotiable. From the beginning, I'd learned from the Meridian disaster that some elements of a deal reflect values that can't be compromised for financial optimization. Thomas's employees had built the company alongside him, and their security was as important as his financial return. The closing was scheduled for the following week, and the significance wasn't lost on anyone involved. The same deal that had been destroyed by nepotism and incompetence was being completed by a firm that prioritized merit and professional competence. But the real vindication came in the form of a contract that arrived the day after Thomas's call. The letterhead was from Meridian Capital, and the signature belonged to Patricia Chen, who had been named interim CEO following Jonathan's resignation. Morgan Advisory Services has been selected to represent Meridian Capital in the acquisition of Continental Manufacturing, the cover letter stated. "We believe your approach to client relationships and professional competence aligns with the cultural changes we're implementing." The irony was exquisite. The company that had dismissed me in favor of family connections was now hiring me as an external consultant because they recognized that my approach to deal-making was superior to what they'd been doing internally. The Continental Manufacturing acquisition was complex, involving multiple stakeholders and regulatory approvals across 3 states. It was exactly the kind of transaction that required the careful relationship building and methodical preparation that had been dismissed as overcomplicated by Jonathan Whitfield. Working with Meridian as an external consultant was surreal. I found myself in meetings with former colleagues who had watched the Goldstone disaster unfold, and their deference to my expertise was a stark contrast to the dismissive attitude I'd encountered during my final months as an employee. "We want to make sure we handle this the right way," Patricia Chen said during our first strategy meeting. "We can't afford another situation like Goldstone." The right way involved everything that had been abandoned during Ethan's brief tenure: thorough due diligence, careful stakeholder management, realistic timelines, and above all, trust-based client relationships. The methodology I'd developed over 8 years of successful deal-making was now being treated as revolutionary, simply because it prioritized competence over connections. The Continental Manufacturing deal closed successfully in September, generating $23 million in fees for Meridian, and establishing a new template for how the company would handle complex acquisitions. The success was particularly meaningful because it demonstrated that the principles I'd defended during the Goldstone crisis weren't just theoretical concepts, they were practical approaches that created measurable value. The completed acquisition contract became more than just a business document. It was proof that professional competence could triumph over the kind of dysfunction that had nearly destroyed both companies. The terms were comprehensive. The relationships were strong, and the execution was flawless, but the most satisfying moment came during the closing dinner, when Patricia Chen stood to address the assembled teams from both companies. Her remarks were brief but pointed. "This transaction represents more than a successful business deal," she said. "It represents our commitment to the kind of professional excellence that our clients deserve. We've learned that trust and competence can't be replaced by enthusiasm and family connections." The reference to the Goldstone disaster was subtle but unmistakable. Patricia was acknowledging, in front of clients and colleagues, that the company's previous approach had been fundamentally flawed. The vindication was complete, but it was also bittersweet. So much damage could have been avoided if these lessons had been learned earlier. After the dinner, I found myself reflecting on the journey that had brought me to this moment. 12 months earlier, I'd been replaced by someone who believed that confidence could substitute for competence. Now, I was being celebrated for the very qualities that had been dismissed as outdated and overcomplicated. The transformation wasn't just personal, it was institutional. Meridian Capital had been forced to confront the reality that merit mattered more than family connections, and they'd restructured their entire approach to reflect that understanding. The company that had once operated as a family business was now operating as a professional services firm. The success of both the Goldstone and Continental acquisitions had created a template that other firms were beginning to adopt. The Wall Street Journal article had sparked a broader conversation about nepotism in professional services, and the successful completion of both deals had provided a concrete example of how things could be done differently. The poetic justice was undeniable. The deal that had been destroyed by nepotism had been successfully completed by merit-based leadership. The company that had dismissed professional competence was now hiring me as a consultant because they recognized the value of the approach they'd previously abandoned. As I drove home that evening, I realized that the circle was complete. That career-defining deal that had been taken from me had been returned, enhanced by the lessons learned through adversity. The professional reputation that had been questioned had been vindicated by results that spoke louder than any corporate politics. The completed acquisition contract sitting in my briefcase represented more than a successful transaction. It was evidence that professional integrity and client relationships could overcome any obstacle, including the kind of systematic dysfunction that had once seemed insurmountable. The full circle wasn't just about returning to where I'd started. It was about proving that the principles I'd defended were not only correct, but essential for sustainable success in an industry that had temporarily lost its way. The letter arrived on a quiet Thursday morning in November, handwritten on elegant stationery. The return address belonged to someone I'd never met, but the contents would remind me why the entire ordeal had been worthwhile. "Dear Ms. Morgan," the letter began, "my name is Jennifer Hayes, and I'm a junior associate at Goldman Sachs. I've been following your story since the Wall Street Journal article, and I wanted to thank you for showing me that it's possible to stand up for professional principles even when it's difficult." Jennifer had been witnessing nepotism and incompetence at her own firm, watching as qualified professionals were passed over for advancement in favor of family connections. She'd felt powerless to speak up until she'd read about my experience. At Meridian Capital, your willingness to prioritize professional integrity over corporate loyalty gave me the courage to document what I was seeing and present it to senior leadership, she wrote. Your story has created ripple effects beyond what you might realize. Every time someone stands up for professional competence over personal connections, they're building on the foundation you established. The letter was one of dozens I'd received. From professionals who had found themselves in similar situations, the Meridian case had become a reference point for people struggling with the tension between personal advancement and professional integrity. I kept the letter on my desk as I prepared for a speaking engagement at Northwestern's business school. Professor Stevens had invited me to discuss the real-world implications of nepotism in professional services. The classroom was packed with MBA students about to enter the same industry, where I'd spent my career. Their questions were thoughtful and challenging, reflecting a generation more aware of systemic issues. "How do you know when it's worth risking your career to speak up about these issues?" asked a student in the front row. "You have to decide whether your career is more important than your integrity," I replied. "But I'd also suggest that a career built on compromising your principles isn't really worth protecting." Another student asked about practical implications. "What would you tell someone who doesn't have the job security to take the risks you took?" "Start by documenting everything," I said. "Build a factual record of what you're witnessing. Then look for allies, people who share your concerns. Sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do is simply refuse to participate in systems that prioritize connections over competence." The conversation continued for over an hour, touching on everything from whistleblower protections to broader cultural changes needed in professional services. These students were entering a world where the lessons from the Meridian case were already being applied. As I drove home from the university, I reflected on the journey that had brought me to this point. The betrayal that had felt so devastating 18 months ago had become the foundation for a more meaningful career and authentic sense of professional purpose. The personal transformation had been as significant as the professional vindication. I'd discovered that standing up for principles was not only possible but essential for long-term success and satisfaction. The fear of challenging authority had been replaced by confidence that competence and integrity were more valuable than any corporate title or family connection. The legacy of the Meridian case wasn't just about one company's failed succession planning or one deal's spectacular collapse. It was about proving that professional competence could triumph over personal connections, that merit-based advancement was possible even in family-dominated industries, and that individuals could create positive change when they prioritized principles over personal comfort. The lessons extended beyond the business world. The experience taught me that systemic dysfunction could only be addressed by people willing to speak truth to power, even when uncomfortable or risky. Change required courage, but also recognition that silence in the face of injustice was its own form of complicity. As I pulled into my driveway, I noticed another letter waiting in my mailbox. This one was from a young woman who had just been promoted to partner at her law firm. Despite efforts by senior partners to advance their less qualified relatives, she followed the model I'd established, documenting everything, building alliances, and refusing to compromise professional standards. "Your story gave me the courage to fight for what I'd earned," she wrote. "Thank you for showing me that it's possible to win." The letter was a reminder that the real victory hadn't been personal vindication or professional success. The real victory was in the precedent established and the courage inspired in others who faced similar challenges. The Meridian case had become a teaching tool, a reference point, and a source of inspiration for people who believed that merit should matter more than connections. The legacy would continue to grow as each person chose competence over convenience, integrity over comfort, and principles over personal advancement. Standing in my driveway, reading about another professional who had found courage to fight for what was right, I realized that the most important lesson was the simplest. When you stand up for what you believe in, you give others permission to do the same. The ripple effects would continue long after the specifics of the Meridian case were forgotten. The principles would endure and the courage would spread, one professional at a time.